So, hello everyone. Welcome to our first ever episode of Exploring Infinity, where we look at all things possible in the area of voice. At least that's the discussion today. With us, we have Jonathan Lacayo in LA and Shanelle Woods in South Carolina. So, I was going to have you guys start by introducing yourselves, but Jonathan has an awesome coffee cup. So, why don't you introduce your coffee cup to us again? So, it says sing
It's
on the
my,
front.
it says sing, and inside the cup it says, two birds never sing the same song. I think that's what, yes. Two birds never sing the same song.
Very
It has a
cool.
little birdie right there. Here's three other birdies that don't sing the same songs.
Nice. Infinite birds that sing infinitely different variations of the infinite variety of songs out there. And that was just
Mhm.
very kind of gets to the heart of what I'm hoping that we're going to start to explore today. So now for the actual introductions. Chanel, why don't you start us off?
Hi,
What do you do?
yeah, I am Shanelle Woods. I previously was teaching collegiate voice at a couple of colleges and universities in South Carolina. So I taught voice at Charleston Southern University, and then I also taught at an HBCU. I taught voice at Claflin University while also maintaining my private voice studio. So I'm now based in New York. I normally live in Manhattan, in Harlem more specifically, and I am the education coordinator for the Young People's Chorus of New York City. And with that, I coordinate all of our academic support services for our choristers, but I also am blessed to teach voice lessons there as well.
Very, very cool. Nice to get to know you. Thank you so much. Jonathan, what do you do? Who are you? What are you about?
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm originally from San Diego, which is only like 3 hours south of Los Angeles, but currently based in Los Angeles. I am also a voice teacher, not in the collegiate area. No, I'm a voice teacher for just anybody who wants to learn how to sing. I currently have a variety of different projects as well. I direct a Christian music program, but it's just like a few of us right now. It used to be a bigger program before, in the before times, with a choir and a worship team.
In the before
Um,
times, like it.
yeah, so currently I direct the music down in Long Beach, which is a city in South Los Angeles, and I'm also in a top 40s dance band where we do like Earth, Wind, and Fire, and Bruno Mars, and Michael Jackson, and Selena, and salsa, and cumbias, and so. Um, we recently started doing like socially distanced and safe gigs again. Um, I'm also a tenor with the Los Angeles Opera Outreach and Education Program. So I mainly help run the Zarzuela project, which is a Spanish-based operetta project for the community where we teach anybody from the community to come learn how to sing Spanish, learn about the history of Zarzuela, so Spanish operetta, and we all do this right now virtually as well. And lastly, I help manage a music school in the Arcadia area of Los Angeles. And there I do production management and I teach private voice, piano, guitar, drums, bass, whatever I've learned throughout my trajectory.
Yeah,
And as production manager, I put up recitals and I do events with the city of Arcadia to provide entertainment for their festivals and outside street markets and stuff. Which again, we didn't do this last year, unfortunately. I love the hustle. I love like running around. I didn't know how much I loved it. At the moment, you're like, oh, like nobody like knows their schedule. Ah, nobody does. But then at the moment, but now I like miss it. I was like, I miss the hustle.
yeah, no, seriously, that sounds, oh man, I knew you were busy and we talk a lot. Jonathan and I have been friends for over a decade. But hearing you say all of that, all like, gosh, I knew you were high energy, but that's a lot. But all the
Yeah,
same,
oh my gosh, I put some miles on my car the last couple of
oh
years.
gosh, well, as one does in
So,
LA. Well, for those of you who don't meet who are watching this right now, I am Karen Wilcox, and my own background is I was a mathematics major, not a music major in college. Bachelor of Science in Mathematics, music minor. But my first gig, my first job right out of college was San Diego Opera Chorus. And last year I was actually in their young artist program as well in the before times, as Jonathan so eloquently put it. So I've just been doing, my story is music couldn't keep me away. I kept singing and I've been obsessed over singing since I discovered I had a voice at around age 8 because my third grade math teacher told me. But anyway, so all of us are in this for the passion. All of us specifically have a passion, I think, for educating and for teaching. I remember one of my proudest projects we were talking about right before we hit the record button was Point Loma Opera Theater. Long story short, right before I graduated, the opera program at my school got cut, and so the students said we're going to do this ourselves, and we did do it ourselves. I came back as an alum, and it was just kind of a Jonathan was also in this program after my time there, and he can tell you it's such a mad scramble. And you've got this big group of people who barely know what opera is, and you kind of just have to rely on instinct. And it was in those moments that I figured out that I really loved to teach and really have sort of developed the mentality that it's great to know what it's supposed to sound like, but the way to get there is really the interesting part. And that's what I want to talk about today, because especially in a field like opera where there's a very defined aesthetic, where there's a very accepted way of doing things right, how do we maintain vocal freedom? Now, we're going to get into all that later, but I want to start off by kind of coming back to some of the conversations I've had with each of you guys about your own work and education in helping people find their own voices, help them maintain their own voices and use their own voices as they are, in the color they are, in the style they are, to the maximum efficiency. Shanelle, why don't you start us off with how do you approach that fine line between helping a student maintain or figure out what good technique is and maintain some sort of a consistency and be stylistically good, but also, or stylistically correct, however one defines that, but also maintain curiosity and freedom of experimentation and freedom of taking risks. So
I think that for me, it became very obvious early on that teacher-student rapport plays such a large part of that, right? Like just developing that trust to where they feel like they have the freedom to explore and to experiment with different things. So usually my very first lesson with someone is going to consist of us just having a conversation, like me asking, what do you listen to? Like get rid of any ideas of what you think a voice lesson is supposed to be. If you haven't been in that setting before, like I know you probably came in with these preconceived notions of, okay, now I have to study this and I have to look at this language and I have to do this and it fits into this very tight box. But I just want to know like who you are as a person. What did you grow up listening to? What are you listening to on the radio right now? Who are artists that you enjoy? What style of music do you enjoy? And then trying to find repertoire that kind of fits into what they're already interested in, so it doesn't feel like such a huge 180 from where they already are as individuals. And usually, and I say this to every student, there's too much music in the world for anyone to be forced to sing something they don't like. Right? Like I wish that I had had that agency myself as a student, and I always felt like people were saying, well, you have to do this because if you study this, then you get this technique out of it. And I'm like, no, I feel like as teachers, we should be able to pull the technique out of whatever piece of repertoire they're working on. And it should be something that they are able to relate to. So I usually start with saying, if you don't like this song, please tell me. You have veto power, As a professional artist, I would never accept a gig if I didn't feel like it spoke to me. And so I want them to feel like they have the same sense of agency. So a lot of it really initially is just about developing that sense of trust, letting them know that like, hey, your opinion is valued here too, so that you are valued as a person. And then that all of that feeds into their artistry as we progress from there.
very, very cool. I see Jonathan enthusiastically gesticulating his agreement. Add to that.
Yeah,
What are your
well,
thoughts?
Well, ever since I started my vocal journey, I've always been immersed not just in classical or operatic singing. I've been doing other stuff, mainly church singing, and and just my innate uh reaction to wanting to apply this to not just operatic singing. So what does it mean to sing big and free in gospel? What does it mean to sing big and free in CCM? What does it mean to sing big and free in jazz? And just so and uh, for the most part, I was always encouraged to sing freely and big. I wasn't always encouraged to sing outside of the genre. I was reprimanded a lot actually, but something inside of me like told me like, no, you need to learn how to use this no matter what you're singing. So I resonate with that, Shanelle, that you give that from the start. You give your students that freedom to be able to take it into what they love to do.
So something stuck out to me as you were just saying, Jonathan, how you were, oftentimes in the academic world, I'm going to speak broadly here because I don't want to necessarily ask you to say what the instance was of being reprimanded for singing outside the genre if you don't want to get into that. And it's really beside the point, because what the experience that I had was I was such a goody two shoes in this area. But it wasn't just that. As I've been exploring my own background, and why have I always gravitated towards opera, because I'm one of those weird people that I just don't have a whole lot of desire to sing outside the realm of opera. My voice always has just gravitated towards that. And I'm starting to realize that in part it was because of where I grew up. I don't think I mentioned this earlier. I grew up in Germany, hearing the organ play Bach every single Sunday in church. Started classical lessons at a very early age. And I realized that a lot of that musical style, I was absorbing it, whether I knew it or not. And so that's kind of where I gravitated to the easiest. But I know that most of us haven't had that experience. And most of us kind of came into opera from musical styles without that being immersed, that background of being immersed. But there's also great richness to be had in that. And there's both of you guys, I think, you both sing other styles other than opera. So I'd like to hear from you guys. How have your other styles of singing informed your operatic singing? How have you been able to bring your own heritage and your own identities into your operatic performance? Shanelle, why don't you start?
I like you were saying, did not grow up immersed in the classical or operatic style. As I was sharing with Karen right before we started recording, I grew up in church, very much so. My mom is a minister. I grew up in that like Southern Pentecostal, like really heavy gospel influence. But I will say that for me personally, I never felt like my voice fit within that style. Like I tried to fit into it because it's what I was around, and that's like what the style generally is in this area of upstate South Carolina. But it never really fit. And I was that kid that, other kids were like, your voice just kind of sounds different. like, you know, I'm like, and I was like, in the choir at church, and I was like trying to do all the things that I was supposed to be doing culturally, but it never really fit. And so I came into the classical side of things more so in high school, I would say, like late middle school, early high school, because of my choral program.
Mm.
And so I expressed an interest in majoring in music in college. And so my choir teacher was the one that said, oh, okay, well, you're going to need some solo pieces to look at. So let's, work on these couple of pieces after school. And it kind of went from there. I never really had formal voice lessons, especially in a classical sense, until I got to my undergrad program. So in a lot of ways, I feel like I started very late. But what I will say that I took from that gospel style was freedom of expression, especially with regards to emoting and like just the spiritualness of it all. Like it just comes from such a deep place that I feel like I was able to bring that into how I sing. So I was never, someone that would just sing something just to be singing it. Like I was always obsessing over the text and what it means and what the narrative is of that moment. And so I really feel like the emotion and the spirituality of it all was the thing that I brought most from the gospel stylings. And I think that now as I've gotten older, I almost feel like I'm relearning some of that style. Like now that I have more of an understanding of the functionality of pedagogy, like I'm able to go back and say, oh, okay, this is how they were achieving that sound, and like make it a little bit more authentic. But for me, it kind of went backwards. Like I got the classical training and then was able to reapply it back towards the sounds that I was hearing growing up.
Very, very cool. Jonathan, why don't you jump in on that topic? How has your background and the very specific musical heritage that you came from, which is, as we heard, you're doing like everything right now. So how do you balance all of that? How do you incorporate them together? How do you keep them separate? How do you practice freedom while still being stylistically genuine? Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, I don't sleep. No, just fine. No, I had a very similar like story as Shanelle, as in being immersed in church music, but my vocal like awakening didn't happen till like halfway through high school, where I was like encouraged forcefully by my sister to join choir with her. She was a freshman and I was a junior, and so I was like, and all they had at our school was like show choir. So it was like Broadway choir.
There we go.
Oops, sorry.
No worries.
I was like, oh, I just felt the thing like slipping. I'm like being really tech high.
Gotcha. Repeat what you just said. I think you covered the microphone up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that I was encouraged by my sister and to join choir, and all the program that we had was like show choir, like Broadway choir. So we would do a lot of Broadway and contemporary pieces and dance ferociously to them, enthusiastically. And I was like, I don't know if I'm into that, but to be like the good big brother, I went for it, and people seem to enjoy what I produce vocally. And I mean, I've always liked singing, and I had started doing like piano, church piano. Back when I was like 14, I was like getting hired to go around and play keys at different churches, and I was like greatly immersed. The community I was part of was very into like very poppy, what we call contemporary Christian music, CCM. And then they were also very into gospel. And at the same time, they wanted me to know how to play salsa, merengue, because that was also part of our culture. So yeah, I was like, and I loved it, like the diversity of it. So there's always been this diversity of music being thrown at me at once. But as I was saying, I had kind of an opposite experience. Like I had to come back to like that tradition of singing, to incorporate it to my opera, because that's where I had natural chord closure happening in my voice. But when I would try too much in the operatic stuff, I get a more woofier back of the throat. Like, I'm trying to go for the sound that I hear, not necessarily the technique. And that took me a good 4 years in undergrad to like figure out. I was like, it could be that easy. So there's like times in my lessons where my teacher would be like, why don't you sing that like pop style? Why don't you sing that like a church? Why don't you sing that like salsa? And we look at how the chord closure would happen, and then that's the same sensation you want when you're singing. And recently I've gotten back into with my voice teacher now. We've kind of come back to that type of mentality. Like where do you find the easiest chord closure, and can we apply it to what you want to do?
I love You had a teacher that recognized that, by the way, like a teacher that was like, "Oh, okay, you get it in this other style. Like, let's do that and apply it to this." I was just like, "Yes, yes, yes." I love those teachers.
Right.
Yes. No, we both studied with the same teacher actually, and that's the funny thing about me being a goody two shoes. I'd been singing classical for so long that that was like the thing that came most naturally to me, and sort of like like you were saying, Shanelle, having to go back because I did sing a lot of sing along with a lot of the contemporary Christian music that we had going on in the house, and I had a decent pop sound happening before I started really heavily going towards an operatic sound, and then trying to go back, once I achieved the operatic sound, trying to go back and find the technique that created the pop sound without trying to superimpose something classically on it. So I think this is a good segue, a good place to segue into what are the actual physics of what is going on? What tools do we have to use to work with here? And I know that I go into vocal anatomy with my students. You've got the vocal cords, they tense up this way. You can stretch them down the other way. If you want to look up the muscles, that's great. Then you've got like the little tilty turny retinoid things that kind of control the approximation angle, if you will. But the thing is, everyone's anatomy is different. Everyone's vocal cords are a little different. Um, and on that tiny little basis, um, little differences can make a huge impact on your sound. And so the way one person perceives a particular sound that they're making out in the hall is going to be different than when another person makes a similar kind of ringy sound out in the hall. They're going to perceive it a little bit differently subjectively because of differences in anatomy and resonance cavities. So I guess the point is, for me, the more I've learned about this, the more I realize there's more that we don't know about how the voice works than what we do know about how the voice works. How do you guys? I know that for myself, it has been a very tricky balance to be able to be confident in what I'm telling my students and helping them to understand the why behind the what, but at the same time leaving room for, there's a whole lot we don't know and a whole lot that you could experiment and stuff that you could produce that I can't necessarily tell you how to do. How do you guys handle that particular tension in helping your students explore and be their own teacher and understand what they have to work with, but also not become too rigid in this is scientifically how it works and this is scientifically how we're going to do it? Um, why don't we start with you, Jonathan?
Um, I'm a very vulnerable. I like to think of myself as a very vulnerable teacher, as in like if I'm having a like not my voice isn't working that day, I'm like, sorry, I just sang a 6 hour gig last night at the club. And I have to rest my voice because tomorrow I have to sing for LA Opera. Like so I'm yeah. Um, and first of all, second of all, I tend to be, and Karen can attest to this. I sometimes find myself lost of words. I'm not always the best at articulating my thoughts. So I'm a very I demonstrate a lot for my students because I find it easier to like demonstrate, and then sometimes the words come to me. And then also there's different levels of understanding. Like, how do I explain this to an 8-year-old compared to how I explain it to a 15-year-old? So yeah, those things tend to play a big part in how I come to explaining vocal technique. Um, and I just lost my train of thought. Can you pose your question one more time, Karen?
Basically, how do you balance being confident in what you know and giving that information to the students, but also being open and, as you said, vulnerable about how much we just can't know and how much variety there is
Yeah.
in what sounds
Well,
we can make.
like it's so cliche, but this whole singing thing is such a journey that till this day I still like figure out new things. And then if I feel like comfortable with my student, I'm like, hey, guess what? We're gonna explore something teachers learning. So let's explore it together. Let's see what these concepts that are being presented to me, what it means to you. What does it, and I might have a whole day where I explore like this new epiphany with my students, together with me, and how, because sometimes I feel that my students catch on like way quicker than I ever caught on. Like even like singing 101, that took me like 4 years to like even begin to grasp it, as an undergrad. Um, like I throw this information to my students and they're like, oh, okay, and they let's start doing it. I'm like, dang, I hate you guys because like you're like 12 and I couldn't figure this out at 20. But yeah, mostly it's that vulnerability. Like let's explore together. One of my pedagogy teachers was telling me that, especially with early childhood, it's all about exploring and having fun and making it a game, because that is how the majority of our learning happens, especially in the sponge and soaking up stage. It's a game. It's when little kids start like messing around with like their bows and something and like start throwing it at the ground, it becomes a game, you know. And they learn that like instantly, like, oh, I throw this, mommy's gonna pick it up. Oh, I throw that, like daddy's gonna pick it up. And then they start playing with you and they learn that instantly. So I feel like a good amount of that carries on into like elementary school. And you know, if for the most part, there's still a sense of that in all of us. So that exploration and the vulnerability and that game-like quality that we can apply to it, seems to really bridge a lot of those things for me.
Yeah. Shanelle, chime in. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what was just said as far as the vulnerability piece. I try to be really open with my students about the fact that I am still studying. Or, you know, if I have had a technical issue and I say, hey, like, I get it, like, I am also working through this thing, just so that they do know that there are no absolutes and we're all still kind of working through this thing. And then also, like, just the physicality of it too, right? Like, as our bodies change, our voices might change too. So just being really honest with them about, like, you know, you're this age, this is probably happening. It's not you. It's not like some deficit that you're operating from. Like your body is going to go through these changes at these specific stages. And you kind of just have to be able to flow through those moments. So you might find that the technique changes a little bit. Also, I guess just to give a more specific example, one of my favorite analogies, I guess, to use in the lesson situation, you were mentioning things not being scientific. So I find that it's better for me to understand the scientific background for what's going on, but I don't tend to use a lot of that jargon with them. I find that especially with my like high school and younger students, unless they specifically ask for that sort of knowledge, like if this is someone that's going to study formally. But in most cases, like finding the right analogy or pictorial references does the trick. So like, you know, when kids come in and they're trying to figure out navigating through that break in the voice, right? Like I'm not necessarily going to talk to them about like what the TA muscle is doing and all of that, but I always say like, you know, it's a relay race. You know, it's like that moment when runners are on the track and there's that switch and there's both hands on the baton at a certain moment and then the other runner is going to take their hands off of it. Like there's that moment of transfer. And you know, there's this relay team and there's this relay team. So maybe like it happens differently for this person than it happens for you. And so we talk a lot about like issues like that, where you mentioned like, you know, what you hear in the hallway might be different. So I'm always asking them like, okay, but what does it feel like? You know, because what you hear coming back to you is going to change based on what venue you're in. So like, can you develop your own sense of that kinesthetic awareness so that you are able to consistently self-monitor, what does this feel like when I'm trying to achieve this sound? What does it feel like if I'm trying to achieve this sound? So you can always do the same thing every time with the understanding that it may change or start to feel differently as you progress and get older.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about is what I term micro mindfulness with my students, as opposed to micromanagement, because you always have to have that awareness and that kind of be able to sense what's going on without immediately judging it or checking it out the door, on the way out the door, so to speak. Because when you do that, tension almost always ensues. And this is where to me, at least in lessons, like the philosophical and the psychologicals just start blending with the scientific. Because in my own style, I teach mostly adult students, 30 and up right now. And with them, I do get into the anatomy of what's happening, but I've also, this is one of the questions I ask myself. Like some of the stuff that I've been studying recently as I've been, kind of trying to fill the educational gaps in my own pedagogical education and really understand what's going on, as opposed to just kind of knowing. Like I was one of those very intuitive singers that I knew what I knew what worked. And I had a teacher who really encouraged me to make all the sounds and get outside of the box of what pretty sounds like. But at the same time, I got so far not knowing all the little mechanics, and I found that finding out about the mechanics, it doesn't necessarily help you actually make a better sound, but it does help me to have more grace with myself, I guess. So how do you guys manage that? When do you guys know that it's a point where, okay, the student, it might be helpful for the student to understand the mechanics of what's going on, beyond just the imagery, connect the imagery with what is kinesthetically happening, and also how that might kinesthetically change as their voice grows. That was the other big thing for me. It's like, why isn't the muscle memory that or the imagery that I'm using right now, or that I used in my mid 20s, why suddenly a few years later isn't it working? Well, the voice is developed. So knowing about the mechanics can help a little bit with that. But I'm wondering, Shanelle, how do you manage that? How do you know when a student is a little more ready for that specific knowledge? And how do you balance that with saying, this is roughly speaking what we know about this, but the physics are too complex to completely quantify here. So that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to ask, and again, like I work with mostly high school students and below. I was working the college scene for a while too. But especially in those environments, I find it really helpful to just find out what their learning style is in general. So I'll kind of, do a little casual conversational digging about how they are doing in their other classes, just to kind of figure out what learning style works best for them. And I find that if it's someone who does learn best from visual things like that, then I go, oh, okay, so I can pull out, the charts of the anatomy and kind of show them like what's going on, because I know that just kind of helps it click for them, versus maybe someone who's a bit more auditory, where I can like say what's happening anatomically and then demonstrate it. So for me, I think it mostly boils down to like, what is the actual learning style of that student, and then just being sensitive to that on an individual basis.
Jonathan, what are your thoughts on that?
It depends for me. Again, since I do approach it more explorative, I'm also learning like sometimes, like it's sometimes image doesn't click. Sometimes if I demonstrate, doesn't click. So sometimes even just writing down like scribbles and stuff on the whiteboard, that might click better than me trying to demonstrate, or me trying to explain to them. I tend to like explain more like the physicality of it once they've had their aha moment. Once they're like, oh, like that feels really great. I'm like, oh yeah, that's because you had like your chord closure, you were able to stretch the vocal cords, and they're like, oh, that's interesting, like that's crazy. And I'm like, yeah, so yeah, but likewise, I tend to work with the younger demographics, so I tend to steer away from more specifics and mechanics, unless otherwise, unless asked about, or I feel like they have a good understanding of what sensation is going on, and so then I, just to be like a good teacher, like, oh, that's your diaphragm going down.
Yeah,
And for the most part, like not that I am purposely withholding the more anatomical things from them or the scientific knowledge. Like I said, it's kind of a sensitive who might be ready for that, or who might learn best having it explained to them in that way. But I do always find that there's something really empowering for them, just like having that sense of, oh, so that's what's going on in here. Okay, I get it.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah, and sorry, one last thing I wanted to
Yeah, go
add to
ahead.
that. And a lot of singing is trying to have your voice respond to what your thought is.
Yep.
So for me, it's I like to think of it, um, I guess for lack of a word, like efficient way of thinking about it. Like what can I easily think about that could help me get there? And I saw this interview with Cynthia Erivo once, where she's like what immediate tools do I have in my toolbox? Like there might be days where I'm coming and I just probably don't have my belt, my high G sharp 5 belt, but I know that I can flip into my head voice there and it could still, produce an effect and the intentionality. So like what immediate tools do I have before me, and instead of bringing the whole toolbox with me, which ones can I put in my belt?
That's a really good image. Like, which tools can I put in my belt today? Like, how much space and I guess, how many pockets you have got in your belt, or yes, whatever the word is, will also vary from day to day because we're human. One thing I tell my students consistently is, your voice is going to be different 10 minutes from now, once we've warmed up, than it is right now. And the skill in singing is learning how to respond to your body, to visualize the sound that you want to create. Well, to know what visualized sounds are possible that day, and what alternatives does one have, but mostly to be able to visualize that sound and then allow the mechanics just to float into place to create that sound. Um, and that's kind of where I want to bring us back to this idea of infinite different correct ways to do it, because there aren't necessarily infinite correct ways to make a particular style. You can't do a musical theater belt if you're doing an opera piece. I was having a voice lesson the other day, and the particular technical thing I was doing or was working on was how to maintain the fullness and the big sound as I flip from my middle voice into my chest dominant voice, and how to create that stylistic element. How do you guys? And I'm trying to find a good way to get at this question, but in the context of using the mechanics that you have been given, that you were born with, and that intersected with what's available to you on a given day. How do you find the maximum freedom of expression, even within a style that is as specific as opera? Because I think all of us have had that experience, with the dealing with the perception that, oh, opera is this sound and you need to put your voice into this sound, and if it doesn't fit this particular aesthetic, then it's not right. So where do we draw the line between functionality and aesthetic, and what is the interaction between those two things? Am I kind of being clear? This is kind of a broad question, but yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan. What are your thoughts?
I think for me, like the prime thing before anything, it's just like is my voice, are my vocal cords coming together, is like my first concern. So I think from there I see, depending on what I'm singing, I warm up. So do I need my belt today? No, I don't need my belt today. So I'm mainly gonna focus on warming up my head voice. Um, uh, do I need my operatic high C today? No, I don't need that today. So but what I do try to establish on a daily is just basic uh, chord closure. And then sometimes I just like one of the other reasons I love demonstrating during my lessons is because I get to teach all day and I'm warmed up for whatever gig I have in the evening.
Hmm.
So that's a big thing that because people tell me like, how do you sing all day? I was like, well, I'm just teaching technique all day. So and then I just go and sing. My chords are doing and not only am I teaching technique, but I'm teaching like this girl who wants to sing Miley Cyrus, and then this lady who like just discovered the flower duet, and then this guy who's like about to enter into his scholarship competition for the first time for high school and stuff. And my day is immersed in diversity, and so I've had a whole day of having my chords respond, since I'm such a demonstrator, to respond to different things at command on a good day. On a bad day, I'm like hoping for the best. I'm like, this is how you do it. I'm like, no, don't do it like that. But try and I'll tell you. But yeah, so chord closure is like numero uno, and then from there, like I tend to attempt to kind of adorn it around whatever style I want to, or if it's a whole teaching day, then I just teach, and then my voice is just responding to what I want it to do.
Yeah. Shanelle, what are your thoughts?
I agree with a lot of what you just said as far as especially the teaching element, right? I also am in a position where I am kind of bouncing around genres all day, depending on who I'm working with, which gives me the opportunity to explore a lot of different colors and different aesthetics too. So then when placed in a more, because most of my gigging or like professional performance opportunities are a bit more classical. But just, when trying to manage the technical aspects with what aesthetic I'm trying to produce for a classical event that day, I know that for me personally, I also have to consider where I am emotionally that day, right? I love what you said about just which tools do I have access to in this moment, right? Like not the whole toolbox, but what do I have access to right now? And a lot of that sometimes will come down just like how I'm feeling mentally or emotionally. And then with that in mind, I go, okay, well, if emotionally I'm not really in a place to access this part of my voice, I can borrow this color from what I've been doing in this genre and kind of assert a little bit of that here to achieve the desired effect or aesthetic while staying in my classical box. So I think a lot of it for me is emotionally informed, but then also, harkening back to these other styles as we keep coming back to.
Yeah, you guys have both mentioned like chord closure, and the other element that I more recently was made aware, just like how what interacts with it and what kind of relates with what you just said. It's like, okay, what color can I borrow from this genre over here to inform what I'm doing today? A lot of the difference between the aesthetics, particularly when it comes to like the big vibrato we associate with opera, is space. How are we using our resonators, and what kind of resonant bounce back are we creating that then allows us to ride our resonance healthily on our vocal cords? So it's not just a matter of, oh, air going through good cord closure, and yes, it's vibrating, but that vibration then affects the cartilages directly around it. And then it becomes almost more like a violin string where you start the tone, but then there's a point where, and I don't play violin, I just got a vivid imagination, but there comes a point where you're like piggybacking and feeding into the vibration that's already happening. So the act of amplification, further amplification, does not take nearly as much energy as if you're just depending on that air pressure, air compression below the vocal cords. And within the context of, oh, there's so many different spaces to use, that is kind of what I found to realize, like, I need to use more freedom here. It's very easy, I think, or at least easy for me to get boxed into one particular space and have a linear idea of I must sing like this, or to go a little more healthier route and say, oh, when I sing an E up a scale, I'm actually modifying. We talk about vowel modification, which to me almost makes it sound like we're changing the way we're singing the vowel or changing the way we're shaping the vowel. And it kind of is, but it's more like we're modifying the space to then maintain the overtone signature that we have just created. So I'd like both of you guys to speak a little to that. And sorry, I'm really nerdy on this level and thinking about it in these physics ways. I don't know why, but it really has helped me recently. But how do you use that idea of overtones and use the idea of space and also tuning your ears to what's happening in the room to then further um, optimize the sound that you're making? Shanelle, why don't you start?
I love what you just said, first of all, because it's a conversation I feel like I'm having almost every lesson. Um, I especially have also worked in places that had big like choral programs, and I don't say this to like shade, choral singing in any way. But I find that sometimes when I'm working with students who have been in those situations, they have done just that, right? Where they've locked into this is this vowel, so this is its shape, like across the board, this is just what I do. And I'm constantly having to remind them of what you're saying. I'm like, the space is not static, it can change, right? Like you might need a different space up top than you need for something like in your chest dominant voice. So just allowing or just giving them the freedom and the mental understanding that like that space can evolve. It's going to evolve as the vibrations are changing, and you have to again tune in like kinesthetically to feel like, oh, okay, I need that shift to happen here, and not necessarily forcing it or manipulating it to happen, but just allowing it to happen. I think a lot of it just comes back sometimes to not like making things happen and feeling very rigid about it, but just like recognizing that your body is naturally trying to do something. I always say, like, you can hear a baby cry in a theater, right? Like we're born knowing what to do, and somehow we've unlearned this. Allowing the body to get back to a state where it just is on autopilot and does it on its own, and we just kind of get out of the way.
Yeah, I remember. I'll get to you in a second, Jonathan, but as I've been thinking about this topic, I was pretty obnoxious as a young singer, I have to say, in my attitude. I never came off that way. I was somehow able to do this. Like I just sort of did my own thing and got away with it. But the whole vowel modification, like I remember I have this, I don't remember what the specific incidence was, but I have this very specific memory of hearing someone say, "Oh, well, if you're going to sing an E up there, then you have to modify to ah." And me just thinking, that's stupid. I'm just going to find, I was like, oh, really? You can't sing an E up there? Watch me, kind of that kind of, and realizing more recently, you kind of have to maintain that a bit of that defiant attitude. Like there's also this bad balance of submitting yourself to superior experience and knowledge. But experience is really, I think we can all, I think we can agree that with voice especially, you can have all the book knowledge in the world. If you don't have the knowledge of being in the arena and doing it consistently, like that's what really gets you from A to B, and that's what allows you to teach. But having kind of that defiant attitude of, oh, well, you say that I can't make this sound in this particular way unless I make an E into an ah, watch me. So that just came to mind. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that's kind of like the nature of art. You learn technique, you learn how to paint strokes and this technique and this and that, and you do it all of a sudden to throw it away and like get something like this, you know. And I love having this art right here. I wasn't gonna use this analogy, but here I am being a teacher. um, like there's so much beauty in the way that the colors emerge, and the way that the it bleeds from yellow to blue, from dark to light, this like good balance between chiaro scuro, haha. um and then and but
Light and dark.
I assure you we were to show this to like Leonardo da Vinci, and he'd like be disgusted, be like, oh, that, like, why are you just throwing paint there? And it's like, no, like I'm pretty sure that whoever made this like learned how to like replicate like the Last Supper, but like the way that he was feeling the strokes emoted this that day.
Yeah.
So you learn the technique to at one point just throw it all out the window, and and trust that whatever's going to come out that day is meant for that day.
Yeah.
Like Shanelle was saying, like, what is my emotion that day? What am I feeling, and where can I borrow colors from? And like, yeah, sometimes I do have to throw a little gospel run in the middle of my Mozart. Okay.
Yeah,
That's the only way it came out that day.
There's a quote that I always come back to, what you said about like sometimes you learn the technique just to throw it away. And it says the purpose of mastering technique is to free the body from inhibiting the expression of the soul.
Mm.
I always come back to that. It's become sort of a teaching philosophy for me. Like I'm always telling my kids, my purpose in teaching you is to teach myself out of a job. Like eventually you're not going to need to focus in on the technique so heavily because it's going to become muscle memory, second nature. You're not going to need me. And then you're just going to go on stage.
So they say.
You know? Like just go do it.
Yeah, no, my favorite moment is when a student comes back to me after taking a break for a while and has improved on their own, even if they were a total beginner when they came to me. And I just want you, that quote was so amazing, Shanelle. Can you tell me, can you just repeat that?
Yeah. So, and I wish I could remember who said this. It was in one of my like undergrad textbooks. I'll have to figure out who it was. But it's the purpose of mastering technique is to free the body from inhibiting the expression of the soul.
Yeah.
Oh.
Free the body from inhibiting the expression of the soul. And that brings us back to the tool belt conversation. What emotional tools? Because I've experienced this in some pretty drastic ways, where if you if you have an issue with crying in front of people, like if you are so stubborn and have developed a personal law where you have a physical inhibition, a knee jerk, physical inhibition against crying, the moment your voice starts going close to the color, even if it's not in the context of crying, your body's going to fight you on it. Your cords are not going to want to completely close. Your brain's going to go, nope, that's crying. You can't cry in front of someone. And all of a sudden, you've completely cut out a whole color palette. So, it's not just what emotional expressional tools do you have on that given day, but what are you doing day in and day out to be emotionally congruent with yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of sense. And honestly, like what I was referring to earlier about having grown up in a gospel style, but feeling like it didn't really fit my voice. Like, I don't even think that I realized how much, like, growing up here and like gospel is the thing I was supposed to be able to do, and hearing people like negatively give me feedback about the fact that I wasn't able to. Like, I was really shy for a very long time, probably throughout my undergrad and early grad school career, about using my chest voice. And I don't even think I realized how much of that just like was an emotional from being told that I couldn't do it when I was younger, even though I'd grown up listening to the style and it's something that was very much in my ear. And that I emotionally connected to. But when it came to actually using that more chest dominant color in my sound, I very much backed away from it. So for a long time, I was with teachers who struggled to figure out like why it was so under supported, when really it just went back to this mind body connection about something else. And once I finally like realized, I was able to like kind of own that narrative again and take it back and reclaim it and say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna move past that now and start exploring that part of my voice. But absolutely, the emotions make a difference.
Yes. No, and again, very thematic thing you just touched on, like the ability and the willingness to recognize all the sounds as valid. And yes, we are picking and choosing based on what we need to do in a given day. The more specific the choice that we can make, the better. But all sounds are fair game as long as you're not doing something that's going to be that's going to rough up your vocal cords on the regular. And I think we may have talked about this a little earlier, but just the whole idea of, it really comes down to what is healthy. Learning how healthy feels, and then exploring the field of all the sounds that are healthy. One other thought that I had before, just purely like technical in a performance environment, especially when singing with other singers. And with opera singers, this becomes an even more tricky thing, because the whole idea of blending our voices together, and this is probably going to be the last topic before we close out, but I've been thinking really intensely about this, because we've all experienced the situation where we're in a group and we feel like we're having to diminish our own sound in order to either fit in with the group or fit in with whatever the aesthetic is that the director or the music director, whoever wants. But also in opera specifically, and in pretty much any big singing style, one has to somehow learn to let your voice be free, full resonance, but also tune your ears to the color around. And I personally think that there's micro adjustments that happen as we take in the color of the sounds around us and find where our own voices fit. So I would like both of you guys to speak to that idea and sort of it's more of an attitude at that point that one has to have, really being secure in one's own sound and being willing um, to find freedom even within that constraint. So, Jonathan, why don't you start us out on that? Because you sing in a whole lot of different styles, in a whole lot of different ensembles and groups. How do you be a team player and at the same time own your voice?
That's like one of like the hardest thing I've had to like learn in my journey of getting to know my voice, because uh I've always had like a voice that kind of like usually stands out, even if I didn't want it to. It just has
Mm-hmm.
a different color to it. It has, or a very like distinguishing color and stuff. And then once I started learning how to sing and being encouraged to just like sing for your life in opera, then I start sticking out like a sore thumb. And so for me, the process of learning how to blend has been almost like a recent discovery,
Mm-hmm.
that I've been able to access the different colors needed for blending more recently than before, when I was still discovering my voice, when I was still learning how to use it, and being told even in high school, before I even started taking voice lessons, like, don't sing here, like, just drop out. And that mentality from my choir teachers carrying bleeding over towards like collegiate singing and choir, in concert choir, I was told many times to just drop out in this part. And then when my choir teacher wanted like a big epic tenor sound at the top, he'd be like, sing the last note. And so yeah, so like that, I feel like understanding my voice helped me engage in better blending situations, and understanding what colors I could produce, understanding the how much chord proximity I needed for that, understanding the style that I was blending into. Because even within the pop stuff, the band, I'm going through 4 or 5 different genres of music: funk, pop, R&B, salsa. These different styles are require a different sound in each song. And when I'm not leading, I'm doing background vocals. And so, but again, like, the more I've come to understand my voice, the more I've been able to learn how to blend, because I feel confident that what I'm doing technically is is correct.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, that whole thing has been, because I know a lot of people like encourage, like learn how to sing in a choir, learn how to sing in a choir, and that, which is what I did because of the circumstances, but it wasn't like in my favor of my voice, like, and I really had to go through a whole vocal journey where now I can be like, put me in any choir, put me in a 3-person choir, I'll blend.
Yeah.
Whereas even as early as 4 years ago, like, I'd stick out like a sore thumb all the time, and I'm like, "Mm."
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking about talking about like a situation like concert choir. In looking back, and this is where vocal development also comes in. I'm pretty sure I had the experience where my voice was so pliable, I guess, before it started really getting into its big voice development, that I had a good couple of comfortable years being able to sing out and just do my thing. And I I think there was a point where I wouldn't have been able to tell you my voice was changing, but it's almost like that little sense started creeping in of I'm sticking out. I'm sticking out. I'm and the tightness starts happening. But the thing was, I was not conscious of what was creating the change or that necessarily the change is created. So that's another thing to be super mindful of, especially as a young singer, and just the constant adjustment, especially if you've gotten used to several years, which I had gotten used to several years of, I fit right in here and I know what I'm doing. And now all of a sudden stuff starts shifting and it doesn't quite feel as comfortable, but you don't necessarily know why right away. But like you said, it's learning what color palette your voice has and learning to listen for what is necessary, what is required in that moment. Shanelle, what are your thoughts? What are your experiences with this?
I definitely echo everything you guys are saying. Like I said, I grew up in a lot of choral situations, and I work with a lot of students who are currently in choral situations. Um, and so for me, I guess in my teaching language about it, it comes down to what you were just alluding to, right? Like an intention versus a default. And there is that sometimes that feeling of like I'm having to diminish my voice in some way in order to blend in. And so I try to approach it in the studio setting where we're looking at a choral sound. It's just another genre, right? Like this is just another area in which you might use a different part of your voice, or you might put a different color on it just for effect. But really, like your technical foundation is the same, right? And so you're just accessing the different color. So it's your intention that you are maybe singing with a little bit of a straighter tone, but that straight tone, like that suppression of that free vibration, is not your default, and that's not like what we're going to use all the time. So just having that technical foundation to understand like this is a genre and I'm going to make this choice, but I can make this choice because I have access to that choice technically.
Mm.
Yep. Very much so. Access to all the choices by doing all of the exploration in an uninhibited way that transcends genres. That's kind of the theme that I'm hearing today. So we're about at an hour, I think. What encouragements do you guys have for our listeners, be they teachers or singers, or just even someone trying to figure out, where do I fit in here in the music industry? How do I find a spot not only where I fit in, but where I have the most to give while not diminishing myself? So, Shanelle, why don't you start, and then Jonathan, I'll let you close us out with those thoughts.
Yeah, encouragement. Oh, okay, let me boil thoughts. I personally have been really encouraged by a couple of things in recent years. One being the exploration that I feel like I'm seeing in the field with regards to people starting to be a little bit more open towards different sounds. Like I always keep coming back to Opera Philadelphia doing "We Shall Not Be Moved," and using like mixed media in that, and listening to John doing like these crazy runs within his arias, and I'm like, that's borrowing from some other style. So it's really cool to hear like things that are being more pop influenced or contemporary influenced or what have you. And then also, just again speaking on a personal level, I'm encouraged by what I always refer to as our summer of racial reckoning in the US. And so just the openness and the awakening that people are having now to leading to just be more diverse in all areas and aspects of life. And so with those two things in mind, I would just encourage anyone who is singing or teaching right now to keep exploring and to not feel like they have to fit a certain mold anymore, because I think spaces are starting to become open that were not previously open before. So I think it is good to come to the table with knowledge of several different genres and colors that you can access, like we've been talking about throughout this conversation, with the knowledge that if that space is not yet created, then there could very well be one for that very unique sound within the next few years. And I'm very hopeful about that.
Or that you're the one to make that space.
Right, exactly.
Yes. Jonathan, your thoughts?
I like to think of my journey as as once Thomas Edison was asked, like, so how did you come up with the light bulb? And he was like,
Mm.
I didn't come up necessarily with the light bulb. I learned 100 ways how not to make a light bulb, and the 101 seemed to be the one that worked the best. Same, so that whole mentality of don't fear failure,
Mm.
because each failure is bringing you closer to your success. So uh, don't fear falling, because there's always the option of getting back up again. Don't be scared of your voice going another direction than what you expected it to. It's not a straight journey. It's not a straight line. It's a tipsy turny up and down type of journey, and it's okay to enjoy the roller coaster ride, even if you might get sick to the stomach at some points.
Oh
But
gosh.
yeah, I know all my like roller coaster phobes are like no, but that's life. Like and the reason singing is becomes interesting is because one day you step on the stage feeling differently than you did the night before. Um, I remember when the political climate had a drastic change in the United States, happened the day before we flew over to New York, my cast and I, to do the or the East Coast premiere of the first opera of the Iraqi War. And
Mm.
so our interpretation of the whole opera totally drastically changed, from when we opened up in Los Angeles to when we presented it with New York City Opera, because the whole climate of politics in the United States had just become a little bit heavier, and so with that, there was a lot of emotions going on, but we use those emotions to tell an even deeper story of of what what humanity is, and how that feels inside of art. The whole project is based on a artistic war veteran of Iraq.
Mm.
So what does humanity look like? And we actually, it helped us gear away from the whole political climate at the time in 2016, and we were able to connect deeper with our humanity. So that whole process, that whole journey of like sometimes things aren't the way that they seem, or they just change day by day. That's okay. Go with it.
Yeah. And I'll close this out with this. The whole idea of being courageous in the risks that we take, both in our music and personally. Chanel, you referenced the summer of, how do you put it, racial reckoning. And this is a conversation that we had. And I'm going to throw in there, I'm coming from at this from a third culture kid perspective, meaning I grew up in a culture that was different than the one that my parents were in. And what you learn in that position is you are gonna make mistakes. You are gonna step in it. You are going to say something stupid. Be willing to say the thing stupid. Be willing to, coming back, drawing an analogy to the whole idea of listening to the colors going on in the room, listening to where you might fit in that situation, and being willing to make a mistake in your attempts, and then being willing to listen some more. And the amount of richness, both musically and interpersonally, that can result from that. So that's kind of the sentiment, I guess. Feels like an appropriate sentiment to close us out on. Just embracing the infinite possibilities, both in our voice, in our interactions with each other, being willing to explore, get outside the box, let other, whatever style we're singing in, let our life experiences and our other musical experiences inform that, bringing that whole rich color palette that we have in that moment at our disposal to the board, and being willing to totally make a mistake and go back and readjust. So any last thoughts? I feel like that kind of closes out this conversation as well. Any last thoughts on your guys' end?
I think you did it. I think you summarized this, but I just wanted to say thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for coming. This was so
Likewise.
I love this.
Yeah, it's fine. It's so beautiful to find a community that's not afraid to express their art.
Exactly. Very cool. Well, thank you so much, guys, and we will see you on hopefully the next episode. I hope this becomes a thing. I will see everyone later.